The morning light filtered through the kitchen blinds in thin, golden strips, casting familiar shadows across the linoleum floor I'd walked for 32 years. At 67, my routine had crystallized into something both comforting and monotonous. Coffee at 6:30 a.m., 2 sugars, no cream, just like Martha used to make it before the cancer took her 3 years ago. I sat at the same oak table where we'd shared thousands of breakfasts, where Mark had eaten his cereal before school, where we'd signed the mortgage papers that still, to this day, demanded $1,847 every month. The payment slip lay next to my coffee mug, a monthly reminder of the American dream that somehow felt more like a burden with each passing year. The house itself told the story of a life lived in stages. The suburban split level in Millfield had been perfect for a young family in '92. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a decent-sized yard where Mark could play catch, and a 2-car garage that had housed my Ford pickup and Martha's Honda Civic. Now, the garage held mostly boxes of memories and tools I rarely used, while the driveway accommodated just my aging Toyota Camry. Each room carried echoes of better times. The living room, with its beige carpet and floral print sofa that Martha had insisted would last forever, still bore the faint stain from when 8-year-old Mark spilled grape juice during a Saturday morning cartoon marathon. The kitchen window overlooked the backyard, where I'd taught him to mow the lawn, where we'd grilled burgers on summer evenings, where Martha had tended her tomato garden with the dedication of a woman who understood that nurturing things was its own form of prayer. The mortgage balance, $127,132.18, as of this month's statement, represented more than just debt to me. It was proof of persistence, of showing up every month for 3 decades, of honoring a commitment even when the house felt too big and too quiet. Each payment was a small act of defiance against the chaos of life, a declaration that some things could be counted on, that a man's word meant something tangible, but Mark saw it differently now. My son had grown from the gap-toothed boy who used to help me with yard work into a 34-year-old software engineer who lived in a downtown loft and drove a BMW lease. Somewhere in that transformation, the child who once listened to my stories with wide eyes had evolved into a man who seemed embarrassed by his origins, by the suburban ordinariness of his upbringing, by a father who still wrote checks for a mortgage payment instead of owning his home outright. Our relationship had shifted gradually, the way erosion changes a riverbank, imperceptibly at first, then all at once, undeniably different. The weekly phone calls had dwindled to monthly check-ins. The Sunday dinners had become holiday obligations. The easy conversation had been replaced by polite updates about work, weather, and Mark's latest technological acquisitions. I understood, in the rational part of my mind, that this was natural. Children grow up, move away, build their own lives. Martha had often reminded me that raising a child meant preparing them to leave you, and she'd done her job well. Mark was successful, independent, educated, everything we'd hoped he'd become when we'd scrimped and saved for his college tuition, when we'd co-signed his first car loan, when we'd celebrated his graduation from state with a dinner at the nicest restaurant in town. But understanding didn't make the distance hurt any less. The catalyst for what would become our final confrontation arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Mark had stopped by, a rare occurrence that initially filled me with hope. He'd been having trouble with his startup, some kind of app development company that I'd never fully grasped but had financially supported during its early stages. We'd set up a joint account years ago, after Martha's funeral, ostensibly for emergencies or family expenses. In practice, it had become Mark's safety net, a source of funds he could access when his own cash flow ran tight. I'd been reviewing my monthly statements when he walked into the kitchen, glancing around with the subtle disdain that had become his default expression when visiting the family home. His eyes fell on the mortgage payment slip, and something shifted in his demeanor, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, a shake of his head that conveyed disbelief and disappointment. "Dad," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone that suggested he was about to deliver wisdom to someone who desperately needed it. "You're still making mortgage payments? At your age?" The words hit me with unexpected force. There was no malice in his voice exactly, but there was something worse. Pity mixed with condescension. The way you might speak to someone who hadn't figured out something obvious, something that everyone else already knew. "The house isn't paid off yet," I replied simply, though my chest had tightened in a way that had nothing to do with my heart medication. Mark laughed, not the warm, genuine laugh I remembered from his childhood, but a brief, sharp sound that seemed to dismiss not just my financial situation, but everything it represented. Jesus, Dad, 30 years, and you're still throwing money away on interest payments. Do you have any idea how much you could have saved if you just paid it off earlier, or invested the difference? He pulled out his phone, fingers dancing across the screen with practiced efficiency. Look, I ran some quick calculations last month when Mom's life insurance money came through. You could have been mortgage-free for years if you'd just been smarter about it. Instead, you're what? Paying the bank to live in your own house until you're probably 70. The casual mention of Martha's life insurance, money I'd kept in a separate account, untouched except for her medical bills, felt like a physical blow. The suggestion that I'd been throwing money away all these years, that my careful, methodical approach to homeownership was somehow foolish, ignited something in my chest that I'd been suppressing for months. "This house is my responsibility," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Your mother and I made a commitment when we signed those papers, and I intend to honor it." "Honor it?" Mark's eyebrows shot up. "Dad, it's just a financial transaction. There's no honor in making yourself house poor because you're too stubborn to see the bigger picture. This isn't the 1950s. You don't have to prove your worth by making payments until you die." The conversation continued for another few minutes, but I barely heard the rest of it. Something fundamental had shifted between us, like a foundation settling in a way that changes the whole structure above it. My son, the boy I'd carried on my shoulders, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose baseball games I'd never missed, now saw me as a relic, a man too set in his ways to understand the modern world of financial optimization and strategic thinking. After he left that afternoon, I sat alone in the kitchen as the shadows lengthened and the automatic sprinklers kicked on in the backyard. The mortgage payment slip still lay on the table, but now it seemed to represent more than just a monthly obligation. It had become a symbol of everything that separated me from my son, everything that made me appear foolish and outdated in his eyes. That night, I pulled out the folder where I kept all the important papers, the original mortgage documents, the payment history, the deed with both my name and Martha's still listed as owners. I ran my fingers over the pages, remembering the excitement we'd felt signing those first papers, the pride of owning something substantial and permanent. The house was quiet except for the familiar sounds that had become the soundtrack of my solitude, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the hallway clock, the settling of old wood adjusting to the cooling night air. In that silence, I began to understand that this wasn't really about mortgage payments or financial wisdom. It was about respect, about the value of commitment, about whether a lifetime of steady, unglamorous responsibility meant anything to the person I'd loved most in the world. And in that understanding, the seed of a decision began to take root. The next morning brought the kind of gray November sky that matched my mood, heavy clouds pressing down like a physical weight, threatening rain that never quite materialized. I found myself standing in the garage, surrounded by the accumulated detritus of 3 decades, holding Mark's first bicycle helmet in my hands. The foam padding had compressed over the years, and the bright red plastic had faded to the color of dried roses, but I could still see him as clear as yesterday, 7 years old, wobbling down the driveway on his new bike, shouting, "Don't let go, Dad," even as I'd already released my grip and was running alongside him, arms outstretched, ready to catch him if he fell. I'd bought that bike with overtime money from the plant, back when I was pulling 12-hour shifts to make ends meet and save for Mark's future. It had been worth every extra hour, every ache in my back, to see his face light up Christmas morning when he spotted it under the tree. Martha had wrapped it with a bow so big it nearly covered the handlebars, and Mark had whooped with joy before running to wake us up at 5:47 a.m., a time I still remembered precisely because it had been one of the happiest moments of our lives. The garage told the story of my relationship with Mark, in objects that had outlasted the gratitude. Here was the workbench where I had helped him build his 8th grade science project, a volcano that had taken us 3 weekends to perfect, complete with baking soda eruptions that had stained the concrete floor. There were his Little League trophies, dusty now, but still gleaming with the pride of a boy who'd hit his first home run with me cheering from the stands. A box of report cards, carefully preserved by Martha, documented the steady march toward the college acceptance letter that had hung on our refrigerator for months. Each artifact was a reminder of the thousands of small sacrifices Martha and I had made without thinking twice. The 200 baseball cleats that had seemed so expensive at the time, but were essential because all the other kids have them, Dad. The $50 weekly guitar lessons that lasted exactly 4 months before Mark discovered he'd rather play video games. The family vacation to Disney World that had cost 3 months' worth of mortgage payments, but had given us a week of pure happiness, Mark's gap-toothed grin in every photo. I picked up a dusty photo album, one of many Martha had meticulously assembled before digital cameras made physical pictures seem obsolete. The pages chronicled Mark's evolution from toddler to teenager, birthday parties in our backyard, Christmas mornings around the artificial tree we'd bought on sale at Sears, family barbecues where Mark would inevitably end up covered in ketchup. In every picture, Martha and I looked tired but content, the kind of bone-deep satisfaction that comes from building something meaningful day by day. But it was the pictures from Mark's high school graduation that made my chest tighten. There we were, Martha radiant despite the chemotherapy she'd started just weeks before, me in the only suit I owned, and Mark in his cap and gown, diploma in hand. We'd been so proud, so hopeful about his future. The college acceptance had come with a partial scholarship, but we'd still needed to take out a second mortgage to cover the rest. I remembered the banker's concerned expression when we'd explained our finances, his subtle suggestion that maybe Mark could start at a community college instead. "He's earned this," Martha had said firmly, her hand squeezing mine under the table. "We'll find a way." And we had. I'd taken on weekend work at the hardware store, and Martha had returned to her part-time job at the library despite her declining health. We'd eaten more pasta and fewer steaks, driven our cars longer than we probably should have, and turned down the thermostat to save money on heating bills. But Mark had gotten his degree, and we'd believed, naively perhaps, that he understood the cost of that achievement. The day he'd called to tell us about his first real job, a programming position at a tech startup, Martha had cried with joy. "We did it," she'd whispered to me that night as we lay in bed. "We raised a good man." The starting salary he had mentioned was more than I'd ever made in a single year, a number that represented possibilities we'd never imagined for ourselves. That success had continued to compound. Within 2 years, Mark was making more than Martha and I combined. He'd moved to the expensive part of town, started dating a woman who worked in marketing, and drove a car that cost more than we'd paid for our house. He'd begun making casual references to investments and portfolios in our phone conversations, using financial terminology that made me feel like I was listening to a foreign language. It was around that time that the subtle changes in our relationship had begun. The weekly visits became monthly, then seasonal. The long phone calls were replaced by brief check-ins. Mark's attention during conversations seemed divided, often interrupted by the ping of his phone or the urgency of some work-related crisis that couldn't wait. When he did visit, he'd glance around our house with the barely concealed impatience of someone who had outgrown his surroundings. The joint account had been established after Martha's funeral, during those chaotic weeks when grief had made practical decisions feel impossible. Mark had suggested it during one of the many conversations about estate planning and financial arrangements that death forces on the living. "It'll make things easier, Dad," he'd said, "for emergencies or if you need help with anything. I want to make sure you are taken care of." At the time, his concern had felt like a gift, a sign that despite our growing differences, he still cared about my well-being. The account had started with $15,000, money from Martha's small life insurance policy that I'd had no immediate plans for. Mark's name was added as a joint holder, with full access, because I'd trusted him completely, because he was my son, and because trust was what you gave to family without condition or reservation. The first withdrawal had been for $3,000, taken just 2 months after the account was opened. Mark had called to explain his startup was having cash flow problems, a client payment was delayed, he'd pay it back as soon as things stabilized. I'd told him not to worry about it. Money was just money, and family was family. If he needed help, I was glad to provide it, but the repayment never came, and neither did an explanation for the subsequent withdrawals. Over the past year, the account balance had steadily dwindled, as Mark helped himself to what he clearly saw as readily available funds. $20,000 in March, $4,000 in June, $100 in September. Each withdrawal came with either a brief, apologetic text message or no communication at all. I'd noticed, of course. The monthly statements told their own story of diminishing resources, but I'd convinced myself that this was temporary, that Mark was going through a rough patch and would eventually acknowledge what was happening. I'd made excuses for him, rationalized his behavior as the natural result of a young man learning to manage his finances in an uncertain economy, but yesterday's conversation had cast those withdrawals in a different light. The son who had mocked my mortgage payments, who'd dismissed my financial decisions as outdated and foolish, had been quietly draining an account funded by his mother's death benefits. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. He'd lectured me about financial wisdom while treating my money as his personal emergency fund. I closed the photo album and placed it back on the shelf, next to a box of Mark's childhood artwork that Martha had been unable to throw away. Construction paper turkeys from Thanksgiving projects, crayon drawings of stick figures labeled Mom, Dad, and Me, report cards with teacher comments about what a polite and thoughtful young man Mark was becoming. That thoughtful young man had grown into someone who could laugh at his father's struggles and help himself to his mother's legacy without a word of gratitude or acknowledgement. The transformation felt like a betrayal, not just of me, but of Martha's memory, of every sacrifice we'd made to give him opportunities we'd never had. The rain finally began to fall as I stood there among the relics of better times, each drop striking the garage roof with a sound like distant applause. I thought about Martha's last coherent conversation, just days before the morphine took away her clarity permanently. She'd gripped my hand with surprising strength and made me promise to teach Mark to value what matters. At the time, I thought she meant love, family, the intangible things that money couldn't buy. Now I wondered if she'd meant something more practical. The value of work, of sacrifice, of understanding that everything has a cost that someone, somewhere, must pay. Perhaps she'd seen something in our successful, independent son that I'd been too proud or too blind to recognize. As I walked back into the house, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window, an old man, alone, surrounded by the evidence of a life spent building something that my own child now viewed with contempt. The mortgage payment slip still sat on the counter where I had left it, but its meaning had shifted again overnight. It was no longer just a monthly obligation or a symbol of my financial shortcomings. It had become a line in the sand, a test of whether a lifetime of steady responsibility meant anything at all. And for the first time since Martha's death, I felt the stirrings of something that had been dormant too long. Not anger exactly, but a quiet, determined resolve. The time for making excuses was over. If Mark wanted to see me as a foolish old man clinging to outdated values, then perhaps it was time to show him exactly what those values were worth. The house had developed its own language of loneliness over the past 3 years. I'd become fluent in its vocabulary, the way the floorboards in the hallway creaked at 2 a.m. when the temperature dropped, the whistle of wind through the kitchen window that needed new weather stripping, the hollow echo my footsteps made in rooms that had once been filled with conversation and laughter. These sounds had become my companions, reliable in their predictability, honest in their melancholy. Dinner had become the loneliest part of each day. I still set the table properly. Martha would have been appalled by the idea of eating standing over the sink, like some bachelor who had given up on civilization. But the ritual felt hollow now. The placemat across from me remained empty, the chair pushed neatly under the table, waiting for a conversation partner who would never return. I'd tried leaving the television on for company, but the chatter of strangers felt intrusive in the sacred quiet that grief had carved out of our home. Tonight, I sat with a plate of reheated lasagna that Mrs. Henderson from next door had brought over the previous week. She'd been bringing casseroles and baked goods with increasing frequency since Martha's passing, and I'd begun to suspect her kindness masked a loneliness that mirrored my own. Her husband had died 2 winters ago, and we'd become inadvertent members of the same club. People who had learned that losing a spouse didn't just mean losing a person, but losing half of yourself, the half that remembered how to be happy without effort. As I picked at the pasta, my thoughts kept returning to the joint account and the pattern of withdrawals that I'd been willfully ignoring. Each month, Mark had helped himself to what he needed, treating the money as if it were his personal ATM rather than what it actually was. The last financial gift from a mother who'd worked until 2 weeks before her death to ensure her family's security. Martha had been proud of that life insurance policy, modest as it was. She'd paid the premiums faithfully for 20 years, even when money was tight, because she had understood that love meant planning for the unthinkable. If something happens to me, she'd said more than once, I want to know you and Mark will be okay. The $30,000 payout had seemed like a fortune at the time, enough to cover her final medical bills and leave something behind for emergencies. I'd put most of it in the joint account because Mark had convinced me it was the responsible thing to do. You shouldn't have to worry about managing investments at your age, Dad, he'd said with that particular blend of condescension and concern that had become his default tone with me. I can help make sure it grows, maybe put it in some index funds or something safer than a savings account. But the money hadn't grown. It had simply disappeared, siphoned away month by month to fund what I now understood was Mark's lifestyle rather than any genuine emergency. The realization felt like a physical weight in my chest, each breath requiring conscious effort. My son, our son, had been treating his mother's death benefit as disposable income. The truly painful part wasn't the money itself, though $15,000 represented a significant portion of my modest retirement savings. The pain came from what the withdrawals revealed about how Mark viewed me, viewed us, viewed the sacrifices that had made his success possible. In his mind, I was apparently a relic who didn't understand modern finance, and my resources were apparently available for his use without consultation or acknowledgement. I pushed the lasagna around my plate, appetite gone, and let my gaze wander to the kitchen window where Martha's herb garden had once flourished. She'd tended those plants with the devotion of someone who understood that nurturing small things was practice for nurturing everything else. The garden had died the winter after her funeral, and I'd lacked the heart to replant it. Now, the empty plot served as another reminder of what we'd lost, another piece of evidence that some things couldn't be maintained by a single person. The phone rang, startling me from my reverie. For a moment, hope flickered. Maybe Mark was calling to apologize, to explain, to somehow transform yesterday's cruel laughter into a misunderstanding that could be forgiven and forgotten. But the caller ID showed an unknown number, probably another telemarketer or political campaign taking advantage of the dinner hour. I let it go to voicemail and returned to contemplating the empty chair across from me. Martha would have known what to do about Mark. She'd always been better at navigating the complex emotional terrain of parenthood, better at finding the balance between love and accountability. I'd been the enforcer when discipline was needed, but she'd been the one who understood when kindness served better than consequences. You can't save people from themselves, she'd said once, when Mark was in high school and had gotten caught cheating on a history exam. But you can make sure they understand that choices have consequences. We'd grounded him for a month, made him retake the class during summer school, and required him to write a letter of apology to his teacher. At the time, he'd been furious, accusing us of ruining his social life over something stupid that everyone does. But he'd learned from it, or so we'd thought. His grades had improved, he'd graduated with honors, and he'd seemed to understand the value of honest work. Where had that lesson gone? When had the young man who'd once taken responsibility for his mistakes transformed into someone who could laugh at his father's financial struggles while secretly depleting his mother's legacy? The silence in the house pressed against me like a living thing, heavy with unspoken conversations and unfinished business. I found myself talking aloud sometimes, just to hear a human voice in the emptiness. Tonight, I addressed the empty chair where Martha used to sit. "He's not the boy we raised," I said to the quiet kitchen. Or maybe he is, and we just didn't see it clearly. The words hung in the air, neither confirmed nor denied by the ghost of my wife's presence. I'd never been one for sentiment or supernatural thinking, but sometimes I swore I could feel Martha's disapproval radiating from the corners of the room, her anger at seeing her son dismiss everything we'd built together. After dinner, I retreated to the living room, where the mortgage papers still lay spread across the coffee table. The balance seemed to mock me from the top of each statement, $127,432.18, a number that represented both my commitment and my supposed foolishness, according to Mark. But as I stared at those documents, another number began to take shape in my mind, $143,000. That was the approximate value of my retirement savings, money I'd been carefully preserving for the hypothetical future when I might need assisted living or extended medical care. Combined with the remaining balance in the joint account, about $8,000 after Mark's steady withdrawals, it was enough. Enough to pay off the mortgage completely, enough to own this house free and clear, enough to prove that the old man wasn't as financially naive as his successful son believed. The idea should have terrified me. Using retirement funds to pay off a mortgage went against every piece of conventional financial wisdom I'd ever heard. But conventional wisdom had also suggested trusting your child with access to family money, and look how that had turned out. More importantly, there was the lake house. Martha and I had bought the small cabin on Lake Millfield 15 years ago, back when the area was still undeveloped and properties could be had for reasonable prices. It had been our retirement dream, a place to spend quiet mornings fishing, peaceful evenings reading on the dock, holidays with grandchildren we'd hoped to have someday. The cabin was modest, just 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that required constant tinkering, but it sat on 2 acres of prime waterfront that had appreciated considerably as the lake became a popular destination for wealthy city dwellers. A real estate agent had approached me 6 months ago with an offer that had made my head spin. $175,000 for a property we'd bought for $45,000. I'd turned him down immediately, unable to imagine selling the place where Martha and I had planned to grow old together. But now, sitting alone in a house that echoed with emptiness, the lake house felt more like a monument to dreams that would never be realized than a practical asset. The math was simple, even for someone who supposedly didn't understand modern finance. The lake house sale would cover the mortgage payoff entirely, with enough left over to replenish my retirement savings. I'd own my home outright, free from monthly payments, free from the burden that my son found so amusing. But more than that, I'd be free from the illusion that family loyalty was reciprocal, that love was automatically returned in the same measure it was given. Mark had made his position clear with yesterday's laughter and months of silent withdrawals. He saw me as a resource to be managed rather than a parent to be respected. Perhaps it was time to show him how finite those resources actually were. I gathered the mortgage papers and headed upstairs to the bedroom I'd once shared with Martha. Her side of the bed remained exactly as she'd left it. Reading glasses on the nightstand, bookmarks still marking her place in a mystery novel she'd never finish. I'd thought about clearing away her things dozens of times, but somehow the preservation of her space felt like the last conversation we'd never had, the final proof that someone had loved me completely and without condition. As I prepared for bed, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd eventually need to have with Mark. Not the angry confrontation that my hurt feelings demanded, but something more profound. A lesson about consequences that was 34 years overdue. Martha had been right about choices having consequences. It was time our son learned that lesson, even if the teaching broke both our hearts in the process. The house settled around me as I lay in the darkness, its familiar sounds no longer comforting, but somehow expectant, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what morning would bring. For the first time in months, I had a plan that extended beyond simply enduring each day until the next one began. Tomorrow, I would make some phone calls. The fluorescent lights in First National Bank cast everything in the harsh, unflattering glow that seemed designed to make important decisions feel as sterile as possible. I sat across from Jennifer Walsh, the loan officer who had handled our mortgage refinancing 5 years earlier, watching her manicured fingers dance across her computer keyboard as she pulled up my account information. The clicking of her nails against the keys created a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. Steady, purposeful, irreversible. "Mr. Richardson," she said, her voice carrying that professional warmth that bank employees perfected like a second language. "I have to say this is unusual. Most people your age are looking to access their home equity, not pay off their mortgage entirely." I shifted in the uncomfortable chair, the folder of documents in my lap feeling heavier than it should. Inside were the lake house appraisal, my retirement account statements, and the deed to the property Martha and I had purchased with such hope 15 years ago. The numbers told their own story. $175,000 from the lake house sale, minus the $127,432 and 18 mortgage balance, leaving me with enough to cover the closing costs and still have money left over. "Things change," I replied simply, not wanting to explain the complex emotions that had led me to this moment. Jennifer's expression softened slightly, and I realized she probably saw situations like mine more often than I'd imagined. Elderly widowers making financial decisions that had less to do with mathematical optimization and more to do with reclaiming some measure of control over lives that had been fundamentally altered by loss. Well, let's walk through the process, she continued, pulling out a stack of forms that seemed to multiply before my eyes. The payoff amount will need to be current as of the closing date, and there will be some fees involved, but nothing prohibitive. Have you spoken with a financial advisor about liquidating your retirement funds? There may be tax implications. I'm not touching the retirement money, I interrupted, perhaps more sharply than necessary. The lake house sale will cover everything. This was the first lie I'd told in the process, and it sat uncomfortably in my throat. The truth was more complicated. I would need to dip into my savings to cover the gap between the house sale proceeds and the total amount needed to both pay off the mortgage and close Mark's access to the joint account. But I wasn't ready to discuss the joint account situation with a stranger, wasn't prepared to explain how my son had been treating his mother's death benefit as his personal spending money. Jennifer nodded and began explaining the timeline. The lake house needed to close first, then we could schedule the mortgage payoff within the same week to minimize any interest accrual. It would take approximately 30 days if everything went smoothly, 45 if there were complications. As she talked, I found my attention drifting to the framed photo on her desk, a family portrait showing Jennifer with what appeared to be her husband and two teenage children, all of them smiling with the easy confidence of people who trusted that their happiness would continue indefinitely. I'd had a photo like that once, displayed prominently on my own desk at the plant. The three of us at Mark's high school graduation, sunlight catching Martha's hair, my arm around her shoulders, Mark between us with his diploma held high like a trophy. That photo had survived Martha's death and now sat on my kitchen counter, but lately I'd stopped looking at it directly. The joy captured in that moment felt like evidence of a different life, one that belonged to people who'd been more naive about the permanence of love and loyalty. "Mr. Richardson?" Jennifer's voice brought me back to the present. "Did you have any other questions about the process?" I realized I'd been staring at her family photo for an uncomfortably long time. "No, I think we've covered everything." She handed me a folder containing copies of the paperwork we'd completed and her business card. "I'll call you as soon as we have a closing date for the lake house. In the meantime, if you need anything or change your mind about any of this, don't hesitate to reach out." The drive home took me past the hardware store where I had worked weekends during Mark's college years, past the elementary school where he had played on the soccer team, past the ice cream shop where we'd celebrated his 8th birthday with a party that had cost more than we could afford, but had been worth every penny to see him happy. The familiar landmarks felt different now, less like a tour through cherished memories and more like a catalog of investments that had failed to yield the returns I'd expected. Back home, I spread the bank documents across the kitchen table next to the mortgage papers and began the process of organizing my financial life into neat piles of before and after. The lake house listing agreement went in one stack, the mortgage payoff calculations in another. In a separate folder, I placed the statements from the joint account, each withdrawal highlighted in yellow, like evidence in a court case I was building against my own son. The phone rang twice that afternoon. Once a telemarketer trying to sell me solar panels, once Mrs. Henderson asking if I needed anything from the grocery store. I declined both offers politely, but her kindness reminded me that I wasn't entirely alone in the world. There were still people who offered help without expecting anything in return. Still relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial convenience. That evening, I called the real estate agent who'd approached me about the lake house. Richard Clemens had been in the business for 25 years and possessed the particular combination of aggressive optimism and tactical patience that successful salespeople cultivated. When I explained that I was ready to accept his client's offer, he couldn't quite hide his surprise. "That's wonderful news, Mr. Richardson. I have to admit, I didn't expect to hear from you again after you turned us down so definitively last time. May I ask what changed your mind?" The question hung in the air while I formulated an answer that wouldn't reveal too much about my motivations. "My circumstances have changed," I said finally. "The property isn't serving its intended purpose anymore." Richard accepted this explanation without pressing for details, probably recognizing that elderly clients often had complex emotional reasons for their decisions that were best left unexplored. We arranged to meet the following morning to sign the listing agreement and begin the process of transferring ownership of the place where Martha and I had planned to spend our golden years. After hanging up, I walked through the house, room by room, trying to imagine what it would feel like to own it completely, to never again receive a monthly mortgage statement, to know that no bank could foreclose on the place where I'd raised my family, and buried my wife's memory in 1,000 small rituals. The freedom should have felt liberating, but instead it felt hollow, like winning an argument that no one else cared about. I stopped in Mark's old bedroom, now converted to a generic guest room that rarely hosted guests. The walls still bore faint marks where his posters had been taped, ghostly rectangles that marked the boundaries of his childhood enthusiasms. His high school soccer trophies remained on one shelf, gathering dust, but somehow too important to discard. This had been his sanctuary once, the place where he'd done homework, talked on the phone with friends, and dreamed about his future. Standing there, I tried to pinpoint the moment when our relationship had begun its slow transformation from mutual affection to polite obligation. Maybe it had started in college, when he'd discovered a world of possibilities that didn't include small-town values and blue-collar perspectives. Maybe it had accelerated after Martha's death, when grief had made us both retreat into ourselves rather than lean on each other. Or maybe it had been inevitable all along, the natural result of giving a child everything he wanted without requiring him to understand what those gifts had cost. That night, I did something I hadn't done since Martha's funeral. I prayed. Not to the God of my childhood Sunday school classes, but to whatever force in the universe might be listening to the complaints of stubborn old men who'd outlived their usefulness to the people they'd loved most. I didn't ask for forgiveness or guidance or even understanding. I simply announced my intentions to the darkness, like a defendant entering a plea in a cosmic courtroom. I was going to pay off the mortgage. I was going to close the joint account. I was going to show my son that respect, once lost, couldn't be purchased with apologies or explanations after the fact. And if that made me a bitter, vindictive old man clinging to outdated principles, then so be it. At least I'd be a bitter, vindictive old man who owned his house free and clear. The decision settled into my bones like winter cold, uncomfortable but undeniable. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of reclaiming my dignity, one signature at a time. Tonight, I would sleep in a house that still belonged partly to the bank, but soon, very soon, would be mine alone. In the darkness of the bedroom I'd shared with Martha, I whispered the words that would become my mantra for the weeks ahead. Choices have consequences. It was time Mark learned what those words really meant. The lake house looked smaller than I remembered, as Richard Clemens and I pulled into the gravel driveway that Martha and I had laid ourselves one sweltering weekend in July 5 years ago. The cabin's cedar siding had weathered to a silver gray that caught the morning light, and the dock where we'd spent countless evenings watching the sunset stretched into water that reflected the autumn sky like polished glass. It was beautiful in the way that places touched by genuine happiness always are, even when that happiness has become a memory. "Your buyers chose well," Richard said, climbing out of his Mercedes and adjusting his tie. "This kind of waterfront property doesn't come on the market often, especially at this price point." I nodded but didn't reply, focused instead on the way the wind moved through the oak trees Martha had insisted we preserve when we'd cleared the lot for construction. She'd been right about keeping them. They framed the property perfectly, creating natural boundaries while preserving the illusion that we were living in wilderness rather than an increasingly developed lakefront community. The buyers were a young couple from the city, software engineers like Mark, who had made enough money in their 20s to afford what had taken Martha and me decades to achieve. They were pleasant enough, enthusiastic about the property's potential, full of plans for renovations and improvements that would probably triple the cabin's value within a few years. Their excitement was infectious in the way that youth and optimism always are, but it also served as a reminder of how much the world had changed since Martha and I had been their age. "The septic system was inspected last month," I told them as we walked through the two-bedroom interior. "New water heater installed 3 years ago. The roof's in good condition, but you might want to have the chimney looked at before you use the fireplace extensively." They nodded eagerly, making notes on their phones and taking pictures of everything. The woman, Sarah, I think her name was, paused in the kitchen to admire the view through the window over the sink, the same view where Martha had stood countless mornings, coffee mug in hand, watching the lake wake up in the dawn light. "It's perfect," Sarah said to her partner. "Can you imagine Christmas mornings here, or summer barbecues on the dock?" I could imagine those things because Martha and I had experienced them, had built 15 years of holidays and celebrations in these rooms. But their dreams for the future seemed more real somehow than my memories of the past, as if happiness belonged to the young, by right, and the elderly were merely temporary custodians of places meant for better times. The paperwork took 2 hours to complete. Richard had warned me that lake house closings could be complicated due to environmental regulations and water rights issues. But everything proceeded smoothly. The buyers had been pre-approved for financing, their inspection had revealed no significant problems, and their earnestness about caring for the property had convinced me they deserved to own something I could no longer properly appreciate. When it came time to sign the deed transfer, I hesitated for just a moment, pen hovering over the line where my signature would make the sale official. This was the last major decision Martha and I had made together, the culmination of years of planning and saving for a retirement that would now never happen as we'd envisioned it. Signing felt like a betrayal of those dreams, but keeping the property felt like an even greater betrayal of practical reality. I signed my name with the same careful precision I'd used on every important document of my adult life. The signature looked smaller than usual on the official papers, somehow diminished by the magnitude of what it represented. "Congratulations, Mr. Richardson," Richard said, shaking my hand as the buyers completed their own paperwork. "I know this wasn't an easy decision, but I think you've made the right choice." The check they handed me was for $171,000 after Richard's commission and closing costs. It felt absurdly light for something that represented the end of so many hopes, but numbers on paper had always been abstractions to me. The real weight of the transaction wouldn't hit until I tried to sleep that night and realized I'd never again have a reason to drive to Lake Millfield. Back home, I deposited the check and immediately called Jennifer at the bank to schedule the mortgage payoff. The timing would be tight. I needed the funds to clear before the mortgage payment was processed, but she assured me everything could be coordinated to close within the week. "I have to ask one more time," Jennifer said, her voice gentle but persistent. "Are you absolutely certain about this? Paying off a mortgage at your age, especially with interest rates as low as yours, isn't always the most advantageous financial strategy." "I'm certain," I replied, and realized I meant it more completely than I'd meant anything in months. "I want to own my house." The statement was simple enough, but it carried the weight of everything I'd been unable to articulate to Mark during our confrontation. I wanted to own something completely, to have at least one aspect of my life that couldn't be questioned or criticized or optimized by someone who thought wisdom came from spreadsheets and algorithms. I wanted to sleep in a house that belonged to me alone, to make mortgage payments to no one, to answer to nobody about my financial decisions. That afternoon, I drove to Mark's downtown loft for the first time since he'd moved there 2 years ago. The building was one of those converted warehouses that developers had transformed into expensive apartments for young professionals who valued exposed brick and industrial fixtures over suburban comfort. The parking garage required a code that Mark had texted me, and the elevator needed a key card that he'd buzzed down from his unit. Everything about the building communicated exclusivity and expense, from the marble lobby to the abstract artwork that probably cost more than most people's cars. It was impressive in the way that money always was, but it felt sterile compared to the lived-in warmth of the house where Mark had grown up. His apartment occupied half of the 14th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. The furniture was modern and minimal, the kind of pieces that looked like they belonged in magazine photographs, rather than places where real people lived comfortable lives. Mark greeted me at the door with a casual embrace, but his expression carried a wariness that hadn't been there during his childhood visits home. "This is a surprise, Dad," he said, leading me into the living area where a kitchen island served as the primary eating space. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I replied, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. "I wanted to talk to you about some financial changes I'm making." Mark's posture shifted slightly, the way it always did when our conversations turned to practical matters. He gestured for me to sit on a leather couch that looked expensive but felt uncomfortable, then took a position across from me in a matching chair that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security payment. "What kind of changes?" he asked. I pulled out the folder I'd prepared, containing copies of the lake house sale documents and the mortgage payoff paperwork. Mark's eyes widened as he reviewed the numbers, his expression shifting from curiosity to something approaching alarm. "Dad, what is this? You sold the lake house? Why didn't you discuss this with me first?" The question revealed everything I'd suspected about how Mark viewed our relationship. In his mind, I was apparently incapable of making major decisions without his input, as if age had rendered me incompetent rather than experienced. I didn't realize I needed your permission to sell my own property, I said, keeping my voice level despite the anger building in my chest. That's not what I meant, Mark replied quickly, but his tone suggested otherwise. It's just, that was Mom's favorite place, and from a financial perspective, you're giving up a valuable asset that could have provided rental income or continued appreciation. Did you at least get it appraised properly? I got more than we paid for it, I said simply. That's not the point, Dad. The point is maximizing your return on investment, especially at your age when you need to be thinking about long-term care costs, and I'm using the money to pay off the mortgage. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. Mark's expression went through several changes: surprise, confusion, and then something that looked uncomfortably like pity. Dad, that's... He paused, clearly searching for a diplomatic way to express his disapproval. That's not a financially sound decision. Your mortgage rate is probably lower than what you could earn in even conservative investments. You're essentially giving up potential income to satisfy an emotional need that doesn't make mathematical sense. Maybe I'm tired of making decisions based on mathematical sense, I replied. Maybe I want to own my house because I want to own my house. But Dad, think about this rationally. You're 67 years old. You should be preserving capital, not tying it up in real estate that won't provide any return. What if you need that money for medical expenses or assisted living someday? His concern sounded genuine, but I could hear the underlying assumption that I was too old and too unsophisticated to understand my own financial interests. The same assumption that had allowed him to laugh at my mortgage payments. The same assumption that had justified his casual withdrawals from the joint account. There's something else, I said, pulling out the final set of papers in my folder. I'm closing the joint account we set up after your mother died. For the first time since I'd arrived, Mark looked genuinely stunned. The color drained from his face as he processed what I'd said, and I watched him mentally calculate how much money he'd taken from that account over the past year. Dad, I can explain about that. The withdrawals were temporary, just until my business situation stabilized. I was going to pay it all back. When? I interrupted. It's been 14 months since the first withdrawal, Mark. 14 months of you taking money without asking, without explaining, without acknowledging that it wasn't yours to take. The silence stretched between us, heavy with accusations that neither of us seemed prepared to voice directly. Finally, Mark looked up from the papers, his expression a mixture of shame and defiance. I needed help, he said quietly. The startup failed, and I had expenses, and I didn't want to worry you with all the details. I thought you understood that the money was there for family emergencies. Your mother's life insurance money, I said. That's what you've been treating as emergency funds. The money she paid premiums on for 20 years so that her family would be secure after she was gone. The words hit their target. Mark's face crumpled slightly, and for a moment I saw the boy who used to cry when he disappointed us, who had once written a letter of apology to his teacher, rather than face our anger about his cheating. But that vulnerable expression was quickly replaced by the defensive posture of a man who'd learned that explanations could substitute for accountability. I'm sorry, Dad. I should have been more upfront about what was happening, but I didn't think you'd understand the complexities of running a business in today's economy. I was trying to protect you from unnecessary worry. By stealing from your mother's legacy? It wasn't stealing, Mark said, his voice rising slightly. My name was on the account. You gave me access. I assumed that meant you trusted me to use it responsibly. I did trust you, I replied. That was my mistake. The finality in my voice seemed to register with Kim, and his expression shifted again, this time towards something approaching panic. Dad, please, let's talk about this like adults. I know I should have communicated better, but we can work this out. I can pay back the money, we can set up a payment plan, whatever you think is fair. But don't make permanent decisions based on a temporary misunderstanding. I stood up, gathering my papers and placing them back in the folder. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, its expensive furnishings unable to disguise the essential emptiness of a life lived without meaningful connections. The decisions are already made, Mark. The house sale closes tomorrow, the mortgage gets paid off Friday, and the joint account will be closed by the end of the week. But what if you need help? What if there's an emergency? The question might have moved me if it had been asked 6 months ago, if it had come from a son who called regularly and visited often and treated his father's financial decisions with respect rather than mockery. Instead, It sounded like the concern of someone who just realized his safety net was being removed. "Then I'll handle it the way I handled everything else for 67 years, I said. "By myself." I walked to the door, leaving Mark sitting among his expensive furniture and panoramic views, surrounded by all the trappings of success, but apparently unable to understand why his father would choose dignity over financial optimization. As I waited for the elevator, I could hear him moving around the apartment, probably calling someone to discuss the crazy decision his old man was making. The drive home took me past the bank where I'd signed the mortgage papers 32 years ago, past the hospital where Mark had been born, past the cemetery where Martha was buried under a headstone that read, "Beloved Wife and Mother." The familiar landmarks looked different in the late afternoon light, less like monuments to the past, and more like markers on a journey that was finally approaching its intended destination. Tomorrow, I would own my house completely. Tomorrow, I would sleep in a bed that no bank could claim, in a room that belonged entirely to me. It wasn't the ending Martha and I had planned when we'd signed those first papers as young parents full of hope and determination, but it was, I realized, exactly the ending we'd earned. Part 6, The Day of Reckoning. The mortgage payoff check felt surprisingly light in my hands as I sat in Jennifer Walsh's office for what I knew would be the last time. $127,232.18, written out in my careful penmanship on a cashier's check that represented more than just the elimination of debt. It was the physical manifestation of 32 years of faithfulness to a promise Martha and I had made when we were young enough to believe that consistency would be rewarded with respect. "This is quite a moment," Jennifer said, sliding the satisfaction of mortgage document across her desk. "Not many people get to experience this feeling, completely owning their home. Congratulations, Mr. Richardson." I signed my name on the final papers with the same steady hand I'd used to sign mortgage payment slips for over 3 decades. But this signature felt different, weightier somehow, as if the ink carried the accumulated force of every month I'd chosen responsibility over convenience, every payment I'd made even when the money was tight, every time I'd honored my commitments regardless of whether anyone was watching. "The deed will be updated and mailed to you within 2 weeks, Jennifer continued. "And I'll make sure the mortgage company processes the satisfaction immediately so there's no confusion about the status of your loan." As I walked out of First National Bank for the last time as a debtor, I caught my reflection in the glass doors and was surprised to see that I looked the same as always. Same gray hair, same weathered face, same slightly stooped shoulders that came from decades of physical work. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer a man who owed money on his house. I was a man who owned his house, period. The satisfaction should have felt triumphant, but instead it carried the quiet weight of necessity. I hadn't paid off the mortgage to prove anything to myself. I'd done it to teach my son a lesson that was apparently 34 years overdue. The next stop was more difficult. Mark's bank was downtown, one of those sleek modern buildings with more glass than seemed structurally advisable. I'd called ahead to make sure all the paperwork was in order for closing the joint account. And the banker, a young man named David who looked like he might have graduated college the previous week, had prepared everything in advance. "I do need to inform you that there are some pending transactions on this account," David said, reviewing his computer screen with the earnest attention of someone who'd learned that details mattered in banking. 2 automatic withdrawals that were scheduled for this week. Should I allow those to process before closing the account? I thought about Mark's gym membership and his subscription to some software service, both of which had been coming out of the joint account for months. Small amounts that I'd noticed but hadn't questioned, part of the pattern of casual presumption that had characterized his relationship with money that wasn't his. "No," I said firmly. "Close it today. He can update his automatic payments to come from his own accounts." David's expression suggested this was unusual, but he processed the closure without further comment. The remaining balance, $7,847.23, was transferred to my personal checking account, money that had been whittled down from Martha's original $15,000 life insurance benefit by Mark's steady withdrawals over the past 14 months. The bank statement showed the history of the account in stark black and white. The initial deposit, then a steady series of debits that told the story of my son's casual entitlement. $3,000 in January for what he'd called a temporary cash flow issue, $2,500 in March for business expenses, $4,000 in June that he'd never bothered to explain. Each withdrawal was a small betrayal, a demonstration that he saw his mother's legacy as his personal emergency fund. "Is there anything else I can help you with today?" David asked. "That's everything," I replied, taking the final account closure documents and placing them in the folder that was becoming a record of this strange day when I'd systematically severed the financial connections that had defined my adult life. The drive home took me through the old neighborhoods where Martha and I had house hunted as newlyweds, past starter homes with small yards where young families were probably having the same conversations we'd had about mortgages and monthly payments and dreams of eventual ownership. I wondered if any of those young parents were raising children who would someday laugh at their financial struggles, who would see a lifetime of steady payments as evidence of outdated thinking rather than admirable persistence. At home, I called Mark. He answered on the third ring, his voice carrying the harried tone of someone juggling multiple responsibilities. "Dad, is everything okay? I was going to call you later. I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I want to make things right between us." "I need you to come by the house," I said simply. "This evening, if possible. There are some things I want to show you." "Sure, I can do that. Around 7? And Dad, I want you to know that I've been doing some calculations, and I think I can pay back most of what I borrowed from the joint account within the next few months. I know I should have been more communicative about my situation, but 7 o'clock, I interrupted. "We'll talk then." The hours between the phone call and Mark's arrival passed with the strange, suspended quality of time before significant events. I found myself moving through the house like a tourist, seeing familiar spaces with new eyes. This was my kitchen now, completely and absolutely. This was my living room, my bedroom, my garage full of memories and tools. No bank held any claim on these spaces. No monthly payment was required to continue living here. The freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying. I set the dining room table as if preparing for a formal meal, though I had no intention of offering food. In the center, I placed the mortgage satisfaction document, the bank receipt showing the account closure, and the deed to the house that would soon arrive with only my name listed as owner. Around these documents, I arranged the photo albums Martha had so carefully maintained, open to pages that showed Mark at various stages of his childhood: birthday parties, Christmas mornings, Little League games, school concerts where he had played recorder with more enthusiasm than skill. At exactly 7 o'clock, Mark's BMW pulled into the driveway. I watched from the living room window as he sat in his car for a moment, phone pressed to his ear, finishing some conversation that was apparently more important than whatever his father might have to say. Finally, he ended the call and walked to the front door with the quick, efficient stride of someone accustomed to managing his time carefully. "Hey, Dad," he said as I opened the door. "Thanks for being flexible about the timing. I had a client call that ran long, and you know how that goes." I didn't know how that went, actually, because I'd spent my working life in jobs where you couldn't ignore your responsibilities to take personal phone calls, where being late meant consequences that affected your paycheck. But I nodded and led him to the dining room, where the documents waited like evidence in a trial that was about to begin. Mark's eyes moved across the table, taking in the papers and photographs with growing confusion. "What's all this?" "Sit down," I said, taking my own seat at the head of the table where I'd presided over thousands of family meals. "I want to show you what I accomplished today." He sat reluctantly, his expression suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. I picked up the mortgage satisfaction document and slid it across the table. "I paid off the house," I said simply. 32 years of monthly payments, completed today. The deed will be updated to show that I own this property free and clear." Mark studied the document, his face cycling through surprise, confusion, and what looked like concern. "Dad, we talked about this yesterday. This isn't a financially optimal decision. I could have continued making payments until I died, sending $1,147 every month to the bank, while my son laughed about how foolish his old man was for not understanding modern finance." The words hung in the air between us, heavier than I'd intended, but no less true. Mark's face flushed slightly, and he looked down at the table. "I wasn't laughing at you, Dad. I was concerned about your financial security." "Were you concerned about my financial security when you were taking money from your mother's life insurance account?" I slid the bank closure document across the table, watching his expression change as he processed what it meant. The account that had served as his personal ATM for 14 months no longer existed. The safety net he'd taken for granted had been removed without warning or negotiation. "Dad, please, let me explain." "Explain what? How you needed my money but didn't need my advice? How you could lecture me about financial wisdom while treating your mother's legacy as disposable income?" Mark's composure began to crack, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. "It wasn't like that. I was going through a difficult time. The startup failed and I had obligations, and I didn't want to burden you with all the details. You thought I was too old and too stupid to understand that you were stealing from me." "I wasn't stealing." The words came out louder than Mark had intended, and he immediately looked around as if afraid the neighbors might hear. "My name was on the account. You gave me access. I had every right. You had every right to take your mother's death benefit without asking, every right to spend money that was meant to ensure my security in my old age. You don't understand the pressures I was under. The business world is complicated, and sometimes you have to make difficult choices." "I understand pressure," I interrupted, my voice rising despite my efforts to remain calm. "I understood pressure when I worked overtime to buy your first bicycle. I understood pressure when your mother and I took out a second mortgage to pay for your college education. I understood pressure when I worked weekends at the hardware store so you could have the graduation party you wanted." I opened one of the photo albums to a picture of Mark's 8th birthday, all of us crowded around a cake shaped like a baseball, because that had been his passion that year. "Do you remember this party? You wanted to invite your entire class, 23 kids. Your mother and I spent 2 weeks planning it, spent money we didn't really have because we wanted you to be happy. And you were happy, Mark. You were so happy that day." Mark glanced at the photo but couldn't seem to meet my eyes. "I remember." "Do you remember thanking us? Do you remember understanding that this party didn't just happen by magic, that it required sacrifice and planning and love?" "Of course I thanked you. I was a good kid, Dad. I always said thank you. But you stopped meaning it, didn't you? Somewhere along the way, our sacrifices became expectations. Our love became something you were entitled to rather than something you were grateful for." The silence stretched between us, filled with 34 years of accumulated disappointment and misunderstood intentions. Finally, Mark looked up, his eyes bright with what might have been tears or might have been anger. "What do you want from me, Dad? Do you want me to grovel? Do you want me to pretend that I'm still 8 years old and grateful for every bicycle and birthday party? I'm a grown man with my own problems and my own life. I can't spend forever being your grateful little boy. I want you to be a man who understands that respect isn't something you outgrow," I said quietly. "I want you to be someone who wouldn't laugh at his father's struggles or steal from his mother's legacy. But apparently, that's not who you are anymore." Mark stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This is insane, Dad. You're destroying your financial security out of spite, cutting off help that you might desperately need someday, all because your feelings got hurt. Do you realize how childish this is?" "I realize exactly what this is," I replied, remaining seated at the table, surrounded by evidence of a lifetime of love that had apparently meant nothing to the person I'd loved most. "This is a lesson that's 34 years overdue. This is what happens when you take someone's generosity for granted until there's nothing left to take." "Fine," Mark said, his voice tight with anger. "You want to be a stubborn, bitter old man who cuts off his own son, rather than have an adult conversation about money? Be my guest. But don't expect me to come crawling back when you realize what a mistake you've made." He walked toward the front door, then stopped as and turned back, his expression a mixture of hurt and defiance. "You know what, Dad? Maybe you're right. Maybe I did take the money for granted. Maybe I should have been more grateful, more communicative, more whatever it is you wanted me to be. But I'm not 8 years old anymore, and I'm not going to spend the rest of my life apologizing for not being the perfect son you imagined you deserved." The front door slammed with a finality that seemed to echo through the house long after Mark's BMW had disappeared into the evening traffic. I remained at the dining room table, surrounded by photographs of happier times and documents that proved I'd reclaimed something important, even if that reclamation had cost me everything else that mattered. The house was quiet again, but the silence felt different now. Not just empty, but complete. For the first time in my adult life, I owned my home entirely. For the first time in Mark's adult life, he would have to manage his finances without the safety net of his parents' sacrifices. As I cleared the table and put away the documents that had changed everything between us, I wondered if Martha would have approved of what I'd done. Would she have seen this as necessary tough love, or as the bitter revenge of an old man who'd forgotten how to forgive? I supposed I'd never know for certain, but as I turned off the lights and headed upstairs to bed, in a house that was finally, completely mine, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. The quiet satisfaction of a decision made for the right reasons, regardless of whether anyone else would ever understand or approve. Tomorrow, Mark would discover that his gym membership payment had been declined. Tomorrow, his software subscriptions would require new payment information. Tomorrow, he would begin learning what it meant to live without the financial cushion that had allowed him to treat his parents' generosity as an endless resource. And tomorrow, I would wake up in a house that belonged to no one but me, free from monthly payments and monthly reminders that I'd once needed help to live in my own home. It wasn't the ending any of us had planned, but it was, as I realized, exactly the ending that our choices had earned. Part 7. The Sound of Silence. 3 weeks passed before Mark called. I'd been counting the days not out of hope, but out of curiosity, wondering how long it would take for the practical consequences of his severed financial lifeline to overcome his wounded pride. The call came on a Tuesday evening, as I was finishing a dinner of leftovers, the kind of quiet meal that had become my routine in the echoing emptiness of a house that finally belonged entirely to me. "Dad?" His voice carried a weight I hadn't heard since he was a teenager caught in some transgression that required adult intervention. "We need to talk." "I'm listening," I replied, though I made no effort to soften the formality in my tone. "Look, I've had some time to think about everything that happened, and I realize I may have handled things poorly. The money from the account, the way I reacted when you decided to pay off the mortgage. I should have been more understanding of your position." The words were carefully chosen, each one selected to acknowledge fault without accepting responsibility. It was the language of someone who had learned to apologize for being caught rather than being wrong, the verbal equivalent of the strategic contrition that had gotten him out of trouble since childhood. "What do you want, Mark?" The directness of the question seemed to catch him off guard. There was a pause, and I could almost hear him recalibrating his approach, shifting from prepared apology to honest necessity. "I'm in a difficult situation," he said finally. "Some automatic payments didn't go through when you closed the account, and it's created problems with my credit rating. My rent payment was late, my car lease company is threatening repossession, and I've got client contracts that require certain software subscriptions that I can't currently maintain. And I was hoping we could work something out. Not the joint account, I understand why you closed that, but maybe a short-term loan, or even just help getting caught up on the payments that failed. I can pay you back with interest once I get this client project completed." The proposal hung between us like an olive branch extended by someone who had not yet learned that some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt with promises and good intentions. I found myself looking at the mortgage satisfaction document that I'd framed and hung in the kitchen, a daily reminder of what ownership actually meant. "No," I said simply. "Dad, please. I know I made mistakes, but this is my livelihood we're talking about. I could lose my apartment, my car, my ability to work with clients. Is that really what you want?" "What I want," I said, my voice carrying the accumulated weight of 3 weeks of sleepless nights and empty conversations with ghosts, "is a son who would have asked for help instead of stealing it. What I want is a child who would have understood that laughing at his father's financial struggles while secretly depleting his mother's legacy was cruel beyond forgiveness." I said I was sorry about that. I know I should have communicated better, should have been more transparent about what I was going through, but punishing me now doesn't change what happened then. This isn't punishment, Mark. This is consequence. There's a difference. "What's the difference?" His voice rose slightly, frustration bleeding through the careful modulation he had maintained throughout the conversation. "You're letting your pride destroy our relationship over money. Money that I needed. Money that was sitting in an account doing nothing while I was struggling to build a career." "The difference," I said, walking to the kitchen window where I could see the empty garden plot where Martha had once grown herbs, with the patience of someone who understood that good things took time to develop, "is that punishment is about revenge. Consequence is about learning. Your mother and I spent 34 years trying to teach you that choices have consequences, that respect is earned rather than inherited, that love doesn't mean unlimited access to other people's resources. So this is all about teaching me a lesson, about showing me who's in charge? This is about showing you who I am, I replied. I'm not your emergency fund, Mark. I'm not your backup plan or your safety net or your retirement account. I'm your father, and fathers deserve better than contempt disguised as concern. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Finally, his voice returned, smaller now, stripped of the confident tone that had characterized most of our recent conversations. I never held you in contempt, Dad. I was worried about you, about your financial decisions, about whether you were prepared for the costs of aging. Maybe I expressed that concern poorly, but it came from love. Did it? I asked. Or did it come from the assumption that I was too old and too unsophisticated to manage my own affairs? Did it come from love, or from the belief that your success gave you the right to judge how I lived my life? Another pause, longer this time. When Mark spoke again, his voice carried the first hint of genuine uncertainty I'd heard from him in years. I don't know, he admitted. Maybe both. Maybe I got so used to thinking of you as someone who needed my help that I forgot you might have wisdom I couldn't see. The admission was closer to genuine remorse than anything he'd offered in our 3 weeks of silence, but it came too late to change the fundamental architecture of our relationship. The house around me creaked with the settling sounds of a structure that had weathered decades of storms and remained standing, and I realized that some damage couldn't be repaired simply because someone finally acknowledged it existed. The house is paid off, I said, not sure why I felt compelled to share this information with someone who'd already made his opinion of that decision abundantly clear. I know, you told me. Every night, I walk through these rooms and remember your mother and me planning which ones would be yours. Which ones would hold grandchildren we hoped we'd someday have, where we'd put the Christmas tree each year. We made every payment for 32 years because we believed this place would be the center of something lasting, something that connected generations. Dad, I own this house now, Mark, completely. No bank can take it, no missed payments can threaten it, no one can question my right to live here until the day I die, but it doesn't feel the way I thought it would. What do you mean? It feels empty, I said simply. Not because your mother is gone. I've learned to live with that kind of emptiness. It feels empty because I realize that the son I raised, the boy who used to help me paint these rooms and plant flowers in the yard and sit at this kitchen table doing homework, doesn't exist anymore. He's been replaced by someone who sees his childhood home as evidence of his parents' financial naivety. The words seemed to echo in the silence that followed, and I could hear Mark's breathing on the other end of the line, steady but somehow labored, as if my honesty required physical effort to process. I'm still your son, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Are you? I asked. Because my son wouldn't have stolen from his mother's legacy. My son wouldn't have laughed at his father's commitment to honoring his debts. My son would have understood that respect flows both ways, that being successful doesn't give you the right to dismiss the values that made your success possible. People change, Dad. That's what growing up means. I can't be 8 years old forever, grateful for every birthday party and bicycle. I had to become my own person, make my own decisions, build my own life. You're right, I agreed. People change, and sometimes they change into people their parents don't recognize, people who take love for granted and mistake generosity for weakness. Sometimes they change so completely that the relationship can't survive the transformation. The finality in my voice must have registered with him, because his next words came out in a rush, as if speed might somehow prevent me from reaching the conclusion we'd both been avoiding. Don't do this, Dad. Don't let pride destroy what's left of our family. I know I made mistakes, but we can work through this. We can rebuild trust, establish better boundaries, find a way forward that works for both of us. Can we? I asked. Can you look at me and see someone worthy of respect rather than someone who needs your management? Can you remember that I raised you, educated you, and loved you without ever asking for anything in return except basic human dignity? Yes, he said quickly. Yes, I can do that. I want to do that. Then prove it, I said. Not with words or promises or explanations about your difficult situation. Prove it by building a life that doesn't require my financial support, by solving your problems without treating your family as a resource to be exploited, by understanding that love isn't the same thing as an unlimited line of credit. And if I do that, if I prove I can stand on my own, that I can be the son you want me to be, The question hung in the air between us, heavy with possibilities that felt both hopeful and hopeless. I looked around the kitchen where we'd shared thousands of meals, where Martha had taught Mark to crack eggs without getting shells in the bowl, where we'd celebrated his college acceptance and mourned his mother's death and navigated all the ordinary moments that comprised a family's shared history. Then maybe we can find our way back to each other, I said. But Mark, understand this. I won't be here waiting indefinitely. I'm 67 years old, and I've learned that time is the one thing you can't get back no matter how much money you throw at the problem. I won't spend whatever years I have left making excuses for someone who doesn't respect the sacrifices that made his life possible. I understand, he said, though I wasn't sure he understood anything beyond the immediate necessity of ending a conversation that had become too honest for comfort. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table where the framed mortgage satisfaction document caught the light from the overhead fixture Martha had chosen 20 years ago because it reminded her of the chandelier in her grandmother's dining room. The house around me was silent, except for the familiar sounds that had become my evening companions: the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the hallway clock, the settling of old wood adjusting to the cooling night. But tonight, the silence felt different. Not empty exactly, but expectant, as if the house itself were waiting to see whether the boy who'd once filled these rooms with laughter would find his way back to the values that had built these walls, or whether the man he'd become would remain forever a stranger to the place that had shaped his earliest understanding of what love looked like. I walked through each room before bed, a ritual that had become my way of saying goodnight to the memories that lived in every corner, every doorway, every window that framed views of a life lived with purpose and commitment. The house was mine now, completely and absolutely, but ownership, I'd learned, was a lonelier achievement than I'd anticipated. Still, as I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Martha for 3 decades, I felt something I hadn't experienced since the day Mark had laughed at my mortgage payments. The quiet satisfaction of a man who'd chosen dignity over convenience, principles over peace, truth over the comfortable lies that kept families together at the cost of genuine respect. Whether that choice would ultimately lead to reconciliation or permanent estrangement remained to be seen. But for the first time in months, I slept peacefully in a house that belonged entirely to me, in a bed where no one could question my right to rest, in rooms that echoed with the accumulated weight of a lifetime spent honoring commitments that others might not understand, but could never diminish. The morning would bring new challenges, new opportunities for grace or disappointment, but tonight, I was a man who owned his house and knew his worth, and that knowledge was enough to carry me through whatever darkness lay ahead.